Richard Sterling believed he was untouchable, a powerful finance king, a beautiful mistress, and a secret escape to one of Dubai's most luxurious hotels. Tim, it was just another lie his loyal wife would never discover. But the moment he arrived, something felt wrong. His reservation was changed. The staff looked nervous. His suite was upgraded by someone he had never met. And soon, Richard realized this was not a vacation at all. It was a stage. And every detail had been arranged by the one person he thought was too quiet, too loyal, and too weak to fight back. Watch until the final moment. Because the real twist is not the affair, it is who Catherine truly becomes. If you enjoy stories filled with betrayal, power, and ruthless justice, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel.
There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a room after someone receives news that rearranges everything they thought they knew about their own life. It is not a stunned silence, and it is not a grieving one. It is the silence of a person who has just been handed a very large amount of power and is sitting very still, deciding what to do with it. Catherine Sterling sat in that silence in a small glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of a building in Singapore, and she let it settle around her like a change in weather. On the table in front of her were two things. The first was a document summarizing the terms of her great-uncle Alistair Harrington's estate, specifically the transfer of his controlling 68% stake in the Ethelred Hospitality Group to her. 24 properties across 14 countries. The second was a printed reservation record from the Serafina Grand in Dubai, flagged during the transition review 3 days earlier. The booking was under the name A. Blackwood, a shell alias she recognized from their joint corporate accounts. The dates were the following week. The accompanying flight manifest showed 2 passengers, Richard Sterling and Sienna Vance. She looked at those 2 names for a long time. She had known about the affair for 4 months, the way you knew about something you were not quite ready to fully examine. She had known and not known, and the not knowing had been a choice she had made each morning when she woke up. There had been a particular evening, some months before, when she had been in Richard's home office looking for a document she needed for a charitable trust filing. She had opened the wrong drawer and seen a second phone, a model she did not recognize as his, sitting face down under a folder. She had stood in the office for a moment with her hand on the drawer and had made a decision not to pick it up. She had closed the drawer and found what she was looking for and gone back to the kitchen and finished the filing and said nothing. She had not stopped knowing from that evening forward. She had simply been deciding what to do with the knowing until the right moment arrived. She thought about the 15 years she had given to this marriage, the charity galas she had organized, the client dinners she had managed, the career she had set aside, the quiet competence she had brought to every corner of their shared life. Before Richard, she had worked as a portfolio analyst at a firm that did not waste talent. Her senior partner had told her, at the end of her second year, that she was one of the best readers of long-term risk he had encountered in 20 years of practice. She had believed him. She had been good at the work in the way that mattered most, which was the way that came from genuinely caring about it rather than the appearance of caring. She had walked away from it at 33 to build a different kind of life, and she had built it well. And somewhere in the building of it, she had allowed herself to become invisible inside it. She had been the foundation of everything Richard had built, and he had spent 15 years looking through her as though she were made of glass. She sat with that for a few minutes. She let herself feel the full weight of it, the disappointment and the waste and the specific grief of discovering that someone you loved had simply never seen you. She let herself feel it cleanly and completely. The way you needed to feel something before you could act on it, rather than react to it. She allowed herself exactly that much. Then she took out her phone and called David Chen. She had known David for 12 years. He was the kind of lawyer who did not take cases he could not win and did not declare victories that were not total. She explained the situation in 4 sentences. He asked 3 questions. By the end of the call, they had the outline of a plan, and Catherine Sterling had stepped through a door she was not going to step back through. She had 6 weeks before Richard arrived at her hotel with another woman. 6 weeks was enough time to do this correctly. The first call was to David Chen. The second was to a forensic accounting firm she had used twice before, in a different context, when she had been managing the family trust and needed independent verification of something she suspected was being misrepresented. The third call was to the FCA contact she had been cultivating quietly for the past 3 months. Ever since the financial anomalies in Richard's discretionary account had first caught her attention, she did not make the calls in a rush. She made them methodically, with the focused economy of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to begin and has just recognized that the moment is now. On a Tuesday morning in early autumn, Richard Sterling stood in front of his bathroom mirror in the Chelsea townhouse and rehearsed a lie the way other men practiced their golf swing. He had been running a version of this particular deception for 4 months, and it had developed the smooth, effortless quality of a story told so many times it had started to feel like memory. He found Catherine at the kitchen island when he came downstairs. She was standing in her robe with one hand on the coffee pot, the other flat on the marble counter. She had always had that quality in the mornings, an unhurried inward stillness. He had found it calming in the early years and had long since stopped noticing it, the way you stopped noticing the furniture. He had a business trip to Singapore, he told her. The Meridian Capital restructuring had hit a critical moment. Chen's team needed him in the room this week, or the whole deal could fall apart. 4 days, possibly 5. He was sorry for the short notice. Catherine poured her coffee and said, "Have a safe flight." That was it. No tightening around her eyes. No pointed silence. No quiet version of the word again. Just 4 words delivered in the tone she might use to mention they were out of milk. And she went back to whatever she had been reading on her phone. Richard had been expecting something. Not a scene. Catherine did not do scenes. But some friction. Some small sign that she had registered what was standing directly in front of her. He found nothing. The smooth, flat surface of her. He kissed her cheek on his way out, and she did not look up. He picked up his bag and walked to the car and told himself that her stillness was ignorance. He did not notice, because he was not in the habit of noticing such things about her, that she watched him leave from the kitchen window, that she tracked the car down the street until it turned the corner and was out of sight, that she stood at the kitchen window for a full minute after he was gone, finishing her coffee and thinking about what the next 6 weeks were going to require. He was already thinking about Sienna. She was already thinking about Dubai. He was not entirely wrong about that. She already knew everything. She had known it for weeks and had chosen, with considerable deliberateness, to say nothing yet. Richard had a habit, developed over 2 decades in finance, of cataloging every room he entered, not for its materials or its proportions, but for its power dynamics. Who sat where the light fell, where the exits were. He had walked into 10,000 rooms over the course of his career and had walked out of almost all of them, having taken something he had not brought in. He considered this the core skill of his professional life, the ability to read a space before the space read him. In the car to Heathrow, he applied the habit to the week ahead and found only the comfortable certainty of a man who believed himself to be the sole architect of his own situation. It did not occur to him to wonder whether someone else might be doing the same assessment, in a different city, with a different outcome in mind. Richard had a habit, developed over 2 decades in finance, of cataloging every room he entered, not for its materials or its proportions, but for its power dynamics. Who sat where the light fell, where the exits were. He had walked into 10,000 rooms over the course of his career, and had walked out of almost all of them, having taken something he had not brought in. He considered this the core skill of his professional life, the ability to read a space before the space read him. In the car to Heathrow, he applied the habit to the week ahead and found only the comfortable certainty of a man who believed himself to be the sole architect of his own situation. It did not occur to him to wonder whether someone else might be doing the same assessment. In a different city, with a different outcome in mind. At the gate, Sienna Vance was exactly where she had said she would be, sitting with her bag at her feet and the bright, focused quality she reliably produced when she was looking forward to something. She was 28 years old and worked in the marketing department at Sterling Capital, where she had spent 14 months carefully positioning herself in Richard's orbit. She had identified the gap in his marriage with the precision of someone who had done this kind of calculation before, and she had walked into it with her eyes fully open. She was not a naive young woman swept up in the attention of a powerful man. She was an ambitious young woman who had made a calculated bet and was currently collecting on it. She had known from the beginning that Richard would never leave his wife for her. That was not the plan. The plan was access, leverage, and a faster track through a company where the fastest tracks ran through Richard Sterling. She had thought she had mapped the territory clearly. She had thought she understood all the variables. What she had not mapped, because Richard had not mapped it, and she had taken her entire understanding of the landscape from him, was Catherine. That was going to turn out to be the central miscalculation of her professional life, and she was not yet fully aware of it. She had thought she had mapped the territory clearly. She had thought she understood all the variables. She had not mapped Catherine, because Richard had not mapped Catherine, and she had taken her entire understanding of the landscape from him. That was going to turn out to be the central mistake of her professional life, and she was beginning to understand it now. At 30,000 feet, 2 hours into a flight that was taking her back to a city where she would need to rebuild everything from a lower starting position than she had occupied when she left. She greeted him with the look she had perfected, warm and focused and entirely present, the look that made him feel like the only transmission worth receiving. He sat beside her and felt the familiar lift of it. He thought briefly of Catherine at the kitchen counter, and then he put the thought somewhere he would not have to look at it. They boarded the flight. Dubai was 6 hours ahead. The car that collected them from the private terminal was a Rolls-Royce in a shade of white that matched the particular quality of the light at that early hour, and it moved through the morning heat with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. Dubai in the morning had a specific kind of heat, not humid or pressing, but dry and absolute, as if the air itself had been burned clean of everything except its own temperature. The car windows separated them from it completely. The Serafina Grand appeared around a final curve of the approach road with the timing of something that had been arranged to appear exactly this way. A single structure that swept low along the waterfront and rose in its central tower through a series of curved forms meant to suggest a sail or a wave. Its facade finished in pale limestone that caught the light at angles that made the whole building appear to breathe. Sienna leaned forward in her seat. Richard adjusted his watch and thought about the week ahead. He had structured the trip with considerable care. The booking identity was one he had used before. The corporate card was clean. He had told Victoria that he was going to Singapore and had told Sienna what the actual itinerary was. Between those two truths, he had constructed a week that served him the way he liked things to serve him, which was completely and without friction and without anyone. He had not chosen having visibility into it. He was very good at this kind of structural management. He had been doing it for 4 months and had encountered no friction. The absence of friction had been reassuring. He had interpreted it as evidence of competence. He had not interpreted it as evidence of something else. Staff materialized under the arrival portico in the wordless, synchronized way that only the finest hotels managed. Richard had stayed in fine hotels his entire adult life. He had stayed in the presidential suites of places in Geneva and in Hong Kong and in New York that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, and he had appreciated them professionally, the way you appreciated an instrument that performed its function exceptionally. The Serafina Grand was something different. It was the difference between a well-made piece and a work of art. He registered this, standing under the jasmine-threaded portico, with the heat held at bay by some combination of architecture and engineering and the specific attention the building had paid to the experience of arrival. He registered it and felt, somewhere underneath the appreciation, the first small thread of something he had been trying not to notice since the moment the car came around the final bend of the approach road. A sense that the welcome was too perfect, that the placement of everything, the staff, the timing, the specific temperature of the air, had been arranged for him, rather than simply for any arriving guest. He was very good at reading when things had been arranged. He had been doing it for 20 years. He told himself he was imagining it. The general manager, a composed British man named Mr. Harrison, was waiting personally. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison said, "a distinct pleasure." The reservation desk was in a quiet alcove where a young woman smiled and typed, and then did something with her face that lasted less than a second. A fractional hesitation in the movement of her hands. A nearly invisible flicker of recomposure. Richard's boardroom instincts caught it before his conscious mind had found the words for it. "Is there a problem?" he said. "Not at all, Mr. Sterling." "One moment." She made a brief, quiet call with her head angled away. Harrison appeared at Richard's elbow, as if he had always been standing there. "There is a note on your reservation," Harrison said, in the voice of someone delivering carefully briefed information. "An upgrade has been arranged at the personal direction of the chairperson." The Celestial Suite. Richard's brow tightened. The Ethelred Group had been controlled for decades by Lord Harrington, a name he knew from the financial press as reclusive and elderly. A new chairperson meant a change he had not tracked. He disliked untracked changes. "Harrison, who exactly is this new chairperson?" Richard said. "She is very hands-on," Harrison said, which answered nothing, and was precisely intended to answer nothing. Sienna, who had been searching the suite on her phone, exhaled slowly. "Richard," she said, "this suite has a private cinema and a retractable starlight roof." His suspicion subsided under the familiar weight of his ego. He was Richard Sterling. People upgraded him. That was how the world was arranged. "Lead the way," he said. The Celestial Suite occupied the entire top floor of the tower and was less a hotel room than a horizontal building, a sequence of rooms and terraces connected by corridors of hand-laid marble. The Celestial Suite occupied the entire top floor of the tower and was less a hotel room than a horizontal building, a sequence of rooms and terraces connected by corridors of hand-laid marble. The ceilings were high enough that the proportions felt architectural rather than domestic. The western face was entirely glass, and through it Dubai was spread out below like a map, the harbor and the gulf beyond it catching the afternoon light and sending it back at angles that made the water look like hammered metal. A butler named Javier introduced himself, oriented them to the suite's systems and amenities with quiet efficiency, and withdrew. Sienna moved through the rooms with the frank pleasure of someone who had decided she had earned exactly this. She photographed everything with the practiced eye of someone building content, narrating in the low, conspiratorial voice she used for her social media, carefully keeping Richard out of every frame. He had noticed this habit early, and had chosen not to examine what it said about the nature of her investment in the situation. Richard stood at the west-facing windows and looked out at Dubai below. The view should have delivered what it was supposed to deliver. Particular satisfaction of height, the sense of being above the ordinary level of things. Instead, something about the suite persisted in making him uneasy in a way he could not precisely name. It was not the suite itself. The suite was extraordinary. It was the manner of its arrangement, the upgrade that had come from a chairperson who had been most specific. The way Harrison had answered his question about the chairperson with a phrase that communicated nothing. The hesitation at the check-in desk. Taken separately, none of these things meant anything. He was very good at taking things separately and isolating them from their pattern. He had been doing it since they arrived. He decided to stop doing it and test the situation instead. "Javier," he said, "tomorrow afternoon I want to arrange a private yacht. Full crew, a private chef. The afternoon through sunset." Javier gave a small bow. Of course, Mr. Sterling, I will make the inquiry immediately. However, I should inform you that high-value unscheduled amenities now require approval through the chairperson's office. This is a new protocol. Richard's smile did not reach his eyes. The chairperson personally approves yacht rentals, he said. She is very thorough, sir. Javier said. His face revealed nothing at all. The approval never came. An hour later, Javier delivered the response by phone. The fleet was unavailable. A corporate function had reserved every vessel in the hotel's inventory for the duration of Richard's stay. The entire fleet for every single day. Richard stood at the window and felt the cold thing at the back of his neck for the first time. That specific prickling that came when a room was not what it appeared to be. The evening's second denial arrived at the concierge desk. Richard had arranged dinner 3 months earlier at Almahara, the hotel's famous restaurant built around a floor-to-ceiling aquarium. The concierge informed him with a carefully composed expression that the reservation had been canceled by the chairperson's office. A private function, the entire restaurant, occupied for this one evening. Richard stood at the desk and felt the pieces beginning to arrange themselves into a shape he did not want to see clearly. He and Sienna ate dinner in the suite. Javier served 5 courses of extraordinary food that neither of them tasted properly. Sienna was restless and increasingly pointed about the connections this trip was supposed to open for her. She had come with professional expectations as much as personal ones, and those expectations were not being met. She talked about names she had been hoping to be introduced to this week. Contacts in the regional development space that a trip like this was supposed to produce. Richard understood, listening to her, that she had constructed a precise return on investment calculation for this trip that went beyond the personal relationship, and that the calculation was not adding up. He said the right things when the right things were called for and said nothing the rest of the time. And the dinner moved through its extraordinary courses with the particular hollowness of an expensive evening that is not delivering what it was purchased to deliver. Richard drank more than he should have and said less than she wanted, and they retired without the ease the evening was supposed to have produced. In the night, Richard lay awake and thought about Catherine, about her face when he left that morning, the absolute calm of it, the complete absence of distress. He had told himself, as he always told himself, that she suspected nothing and noticed less, and was simply too absorbed in the domestic world he had assigned her to see what was directly in front of her. He told himself this again in the dark of the celestial suite and found, for the first time, that he could not quite force himself to believe it. The second morning arrived clear and hot, and Richard applied to it the working resolution of a man who had managed difficult situations before. He had made this kind of mistake in other contexts, finding pattern in what was simply circumstance, and he had learned over the years to check it. The upgrade was a courtesy from a new leadership team. The yacht was a scheduling conflict. The restaurant was what Harrison said it was. He had been in the hotel for less than 24 hours, and he was constructing a threat narrative from coincidence. He was Richard Sterling. He had built a company worth billions and had managed difficult situations for 20 years, and he told himself very firmly, fine. He ordered breakfast on the terrace, and the food was extraordinary. And Sienna was charming in the morning in the way she reliably was, and for a while, the sun and the Gulf were doing what they were supposed to do. She talked about her social media engagement numbers with the footage from the night before, which had apparently performed exceptionally well, and she talked about some contacts she had been hoping this trip would produce. And she talked with the easy, bright fluency of someone who had decided to act as if the previous evening had not happened. Richard understood this as a strategy rather than genuine recovery. He understood it because it was the same strategy he had been applying since he woke up. He watched her performance of normalcy and recognized it for what it was because he was running the same performance across the table. Two people pretending to each other that the walls were not already closing in. Then he tried again for the yacht. The fleet remained entirely unavailable. Every vessel, for every remaining day of his stay. He went downstairs. He moved through the ground floor corridors with the deliberate, purposeful ease of someone who belonged somewhere and was not inspecting it. He turned a corner near the hotel's jewelry concession and stopped. Coming down the connecting corridor was Harrison, moving with clear intent, leading a group of 4 people in business attire. Richard registered and categorized them before they were fully in his sight line. He knew how these people moved: the closed professional focus, the economical coverage of ground, the way they communicated in abbreviated shorthand that implied a shared framework of what was being looked for. He had hired forensic accountants enough times to know them on sight. Harrison saw Richard. Their eyes met. Harrison's expression did not change by a degree. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling. I hope you are finding everything to your satisfaction. The chairperson has also expressed interest in meeting you personally. She would like to extend a welcome. Her assistant will contact you this morning to arrange something for this afternoon." Continued walking. The team followed. They disappeared through a staff access door, and the corridor was empty. Richard turned and walked back toward the private elevator at a pace he could not entirely control. He stopped at the jewelry boutique on the lobby level. He chose a piece, a diamond cuff, and offered his personal credit card. "I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling," the sales associate said. After a moment of professional discomfort, "The system is showing a security hold on this account. I have tried it twice." He left without the cuff and without explanation. In the corridor outside the boutique, he stood still and let himself complete the thought he had been refusing since check-in. A hold on his personal Amex required an active instruction from the account holder. There were 2 account holders. He was one of them. The other one was a woman who had said have a safe flight 4 days ago and had then, by everything the evidence suggested, been running this operation from a position 2 steps ahead of him for the entire duration of his stay. He stood in the corridor of the most expensive hotel in Dubai and allowed that thought to complete itself without interruption for the first time. And what he felt in the moment of its completion was not quite fear and not quite anger. It was something closer to the sensation of a floor disappearing. He rode the elevator back to the penthouse, and his hands were steady and the rest of him was not. His phone showed a message from Javier. The chairperson had requested a meeting in the Celestial Suite at 3 o'clock. She would come to him. Richard sat in the large armchair facing the door. He had 2 hours. He used some of it trying to reach the outside world from his mobile, working through every number he had with the systematic persistence of someone who refused to accept a boundary until he had tested it fully. Every outgoing call produced the same result. The calls were going nowhere. He used some of the remaining time attempting to construct a position. That was what he did in difficult situations. He assembled information, identified the positions available to him, prepared to hold one. The problem was the information. Every piece of it pointed in the same direction. The upgrade, the denied amenities, the forensic accountants in the corridor, the frozen card, the new chairperson. Taken separately, none of these things meant anything. He had been taking them separately since check-in and had been refusing to complete the pattern. Sitting in the armchair with the minutes passing and the 3 o'clock appointment advancing toward him. He completed it now. He thought about Catherine. He thought about Lord Harrington. He thought about something Catherine had mentioned once at a family dinner years ago, in passing, in the way she mentioned most things she considered private. A family connection on her mother's side, an elderly great-uncle, hotels. He had been half listening at the time. He had been half listening for 15 years. The cost of that particular habit was becoming visible to him now, very quickly, all at once. He thought about Catherine. He thought about Lord Harrington. He thought about something Catherine had mentioned once at a family dinner years ago, in passing, in the way she mentioned most things she considered private. A family connection on her mother's side, an elderly great-uncle, hotels. He had been half listening at the time. He had been half listening for 15 years. The cost of that particular habit was becoming visible to him now, very quickly, all at once. By 2:45, Richard had changed into his most formidable suit, a bespoke piece from Savile Row that had never failed to communicate what it was supposed to communicate. He told Sienna there was a meeting, that she should say nothing unless directly addressed, and gave no further explanation. She changed into something conservative and sat on the far sofa with her hands in her lap. The space between them in the room was very quiet and very loaded. He had spent the previous hour trying to find the angle, the gap in whatever was coming that he could use. He had spent 20 years finding angles in difficult rooms, and he could not find one now. Whatever was about to walk through the door had been prepared by someone who knew where the angles would be and had already closed them. Javier announced the visitors at 2:58. The first person through the door was David Chen. Richard recognized him and felt the cold thing on his neck spread to his chest. Chen did not do divorces. He did the work that required the most complete and airtight preparation, the kind of cases where the stakes were high enough that there was no room for a loose edge anywhere. Behind Chen came two others, a man and a woman, who took positions flanking the entrance with the quiet, synchronized ease of people who had done this particular thing before. And then Catherine walked in. Richard had 15 years of his wife's face. He could have reproduced every line of it from memory in complete darkness. The woman who came through the door of the celestial suite wore his wife's face and his wife's eyes, and was, in the most practical sense, someone he had never met. She was wearing a suit he had never seen, deep sapphire, the cut of something made for a specific body by someone who understood that the shoulder was where authority lived in a garment. Her hair was drawn back in a clean, deliberate arrangement that showed her jaw and the line of her neck. No jewelry except for small diamond studs and her platinum wedding band, the plain ring she had chosen herself and worn every day for 15 years, which sat on her hand and looked, in that moment, less like a sign of marriage than a marker of permanent record. She moved through the suite with something that was not arrogance exactly, something older than arrogance, the specific certainty of someone who knew where they were, who had chosen to be here, and who had arranged to be here, and who found the whole arrangement complete. Her eyes moved through the suite with the expression of someone taking inventory. They settled briefly on Sienna, who made a small involuntary sound, and then her gaze came to Richard. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was entirely the same. The calibration, the register, the mid-morning at the kitchen Iceland tone she used for grocery lists and household logistics. The complete normalcy of it was the most disorienting thing in the room. "Sit down," she said, not a request. The phrasing of something decided. He sat, Sienna sat. David Chen placed folders on the dining table without comment. Catherine walked to the head of the table and placed her hands on the back of the chair there. She did not sit. She would not sit for the duration of what followed. "My great-uncle Alistair Harrington died 2 months ago," she said. "You did not see it in the press because there was nothing in the press to see. He had spent 50 years arranging his professional life to generate exactly no coverage, and he arranged the end of his life the same way. You met him once. At our wedding. You found him unremarkable, an elderly man who owned some hotels. You exchanged perhaps 8 words with him, and then moved on to someone more useful to you." She paused. "His estate, including a controlling 68% stake in the Ethelred Hospitality Group, passed to me. He had no children. My mother was his half-sister, a connection he maintained privately for decades. It was not a surprise to me. It was a door I had been waiting to see opened 8 weeks ago, when my team began reviewing the reservation systems across Ethelred properties as part of the transition process. A booking came up at this hotel under a name I recognized, a corporate alias linked to a card account I have full visibility on. I checked the flight manifests from Heathrow for the relevant date. There you were, Richard Sterling, and on the seat beside you, booked on the same reservation, Sienna Vance, Marketing Department, Sterling Capital." She looked at Sienna. The look lasted less than 3 seconds, and had the quality of a look directed at something that has already been fully categorized. "Miss Vance," she said, "your travel expenses over the past year include 9 business-class flights that do not correspond to any client entertainment record. Your accommodation billing shows 4 hotels that appear on no company expense submission. Your total travel spend is more than double the allocation for your position level. I imagine Sterling Capital's board will find this interesting reading when David's package arrives on their desks tomorrow morning." She looked away from Sienna as if turning a page. "When I understood what I was looking at," she continued, returning to Richard, "I made some decisions. The upgrade to this suite was deliberate. It has the most complete surveillance infrastructure in the property. Every request you have made since you arrived has been logged. The yacht fleet is reserved for a corporate function, which is my board. The restaurant was hosting my executive team on their first evening in residence. Your personal credit card was frozen while you were somewhere over the Mediterranean on the way here. I was on a call with our family solicitor and the bank's fraud assessment team. I have placed a temporary freeze on all jointly held assets pending a full forensic review, which has already been underway for 2 weeks. And the people in the corridor this morning were not hotel staff. They are forensic accountants. They have been in this building since yesterday." Richard's voice came out thinner than he wanted. "You cannot freeze our joint assets unilaterally. That money is mine, is it?" Catherine said, and her voice dropped in a way that was worse than raised. "Is it your money, Richard? The fortune you accumulated was built on a foundation I maintained, the home I ran without acknowledgement, the clients I entertained, the social infrastructure I built that made your reputation possible. The years I set aside a career I was genuinely good at to support one you were still building. I had a senior partner at my firm who told me I was one of the best readers of long-term risk he had encountered in 20 years of practice. You have never known that because you never asked. You took that contribution, and you treated it as background noise. And then you took our shared financial resources and you spent them on this." She did not gesture at Sienna. "She did not need to. This is insane," Richard said, and heard immediately how the words sounded. "This is a forensic audit," Catherine said. "It is the most rational thing that has happened in this marriage in a very long time." She walked around the table until she was standing behind his chair. He could feel the weight of her presence behind him, something he had never experienced from her in 15 years of marriage. "For 15 years," she said, "you arranged your life with the assumption that I was not paying attention. You made decisions about our shared resources without consulting me. You made decisions about who I was without once asking. You placed me in the category of background, and you kept me there, and you never looked to see whether the category was accurate. Do you know what I did with that? Every piece of attention I had that you were not using, every capability you had decided was not relevant to your version of what I was, I did not let it atrophy. I kept it sharp, privately, without any particular plan. The way you kept things sharp, because not keeping them sharp felt like a form of surrender. I did not know, when I was doing it, that I was also building the case that is now sitting in front of you in that envelope. I was simply refusing to become only what you had decided I was." She returned to the head of the table. David Chen placed a thick envelope in front of Richard. "Those are the divorce petition and financial disclosures," Catherine said. "I am petitioning on grounds of adultery and financial misconduct. The documentation is complete. You can fight this, and you will lose. And the fighting will cost you considerably more than the settlement you lose. Or you can sign what David puts in front of you and keep what I have left you in that agreement, which is more than the evidence entitles you to and less than you expected." She straightened. "I also have one more item for you to consider, but that can wait until tomorrow morning." She gave a small nod to Chen. He and the 2 executives stood. Catherine moved toward the door. Richard said her name. She stopped, turned part of the way. "Why?" he said. The word came out without its usual architecture. Just the word itself, plain and exposed. "Why all of this, Catherine? Why not simply file?" She was quiet for a moment. When she looked at him, her expression was not the cold satisfaction he had been bracing for. It was something that had more exhaustion in it than anything else. "Because you did not just betray me," she said. "You erased me. For 15 years you looked at me and saw something useful and familiar, and you stopped looking. You decided I was not worth the full attention. You were not cruel about it. It was much more ordinary than cruelty. You just decided, and you never revisited the decision." She held his eyes. "I needed you to know that was wrong. Not for your benefit, for mine. I want you to understand what that means precisely. It does not mean I am performing strength. It means that for 15 years there was a woman in your house who graduated top of her year from an institution you know the name of, who managed a portfolio to returns you would have respected if a colleague had produced them, who read every financial situation she encountered with the same quality of attention you apply to acquisition targets. And you chose, each year, not to look at her. You chose to look at the part that was useful to you and to treat the rest as background. That is the thing I needed you to know." She went. David Chen placed his card on the table quietly and followed her out. The doors closed with the soft, complete sound of very expensive engineering. The room held the silence for a moment. It was a very particular kind of silence, the specific quality of a room from which all the air has been removed by something that happened in it, and which cannot quite recover the ordinary temperature of before. Javier materialized briefly from the service entrance and refilled the water glasses, and withdrew without making eye contact with either of them. The city outside the windows continued to be the city. The Gulf continued to be the Gulf. Everything in the room that was not Richard and Sienna continued its appointed business with a perfect indifference that was, in its own way, the most useful thing in the room. The suite was silent. Richard sat at the table and looked at the envelope and did not pick it up. Sienna, on the far sofa, had both hands pressed flat on her knees and was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who is processing an amount of information that exceeds their current capacity. The extraordinary suite continued to be extraordinary around them. The last of the afternoon light was crossing the floor toward the western wall. Javier had materialized from the service entrance at some point during the final minutes of the meeting and had removed the champagne that had been on the side table since their arrival. The removal of it, that small, unremarkable piece of housekeeping, landed with a finality that was somehow worse than anything that had been said in the previous 45 minutes. Richard swept the nearer end of the table clear. A glass, a decorative bowl, nothing expensive but loud on the marble floor. He grabbed his phone and tried his personal solicitor. 2 rings, then a recording. He tried his executive assistant. Nothing. The main trading floor line. Nothing. He tried 3 other numbers and received nothing from any of them. Javier appeared from the service entrance with the unruffled efficiency of someone for whom this particular kind of scene was simply another item in his professional inventory. He swept the glass and the broken pieces without comment and withdrew. "Are the phones blocked?" Richard said. "External outgoing lines have been suspended at the chairperson's direction," Javier said, "for guest privacy during the review period. If there is anything I can assist with internally." "I am available. Get out," Richard said. Javier nodded once and went. Sienna retreated to the smaller bedroom. Her door was not quite closed. After a few minutes he heard her voice, low and deliberate, the specific cadence of someone who had located a working line and was using it with purpose. Her outgoing calls were apparently not blocked. He stood near the door without intending to, and caught the shape of what she was saying without the details. She was calling someone, describing what she had access to, talking about files, about what she was prepared to provide and what she wanted in exchange. He moved away from the door. He had believed, when he arranged this trip, that Sienna was someone whose primary interest was in him, that her attention was a form of genuine feeling. He had believed this because it was more comfortable than the alternative, and the alternative was that he had been as legible to her as a target, that she had identified his vulnerabilities with the same systematic attention he applied to his competitors, and that the past 14 months had been a strategic position rather than a relationship. He poured a drink and sat in the armchair and let himself think clearly for the first time since Catherine had walked through the door. He thought about David Chen and what Chen's presence meant for the legal proceedings. He thought about 6 weeks of forensic work on his accounts and what a genuinely motivated team with full access would find in them. He thought about the discretionary expense account, which had been the funding mechanism for this trip and for several others like it. He had structured it to survive normal examination. He had not stress-tested it against someone who was building a case rather than conducting routine compliance. That evening, a single email came through from the outside world. His incoming messages were not blocked, which told him something about what Catherine wanted him to know, and when she wanted him to know it. The sender was Jeffrey Marsh, his partner at Sterling Capital, and the subject line was written in capitals. Richard, Jeffrey wrote, the tone stripped of every professional warmth that usually softened their correspondence. We have been contacted this morning by legal counsel representing the Ethelred Hospitality Group, acting on behalf of Catherine Sterling. They have presented the board with documentation of what they are describing as systematic misuse of corporate funds over a 4-year period. The documentation is detailed and it appears credible. An emergency board session convened this afternoon. Forensic accountants retained by Mrs. Sterling are arriving at our London offices tomorrow morning. The board voted unanimously to suspend your trading access and management responsibilities effective immediately, pending an independent audit. There is also a preliminary notification from the FCA indicating an inquiry into trading activity across 3 specific accounts. Richard, I do not know how to tell you this except directly. Find a criminal solicitor before you do anything else. Not a corporate lawyer, a criminal solicitor. Do not contact the office. Do not contact any board member. Do not do anything until you have counsel. Richard set the phone on the marble table with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something that might detonate. He sat with the words of Jeffrey's email arranged in front of him and tried to assess them with the professional detachment he had been applying to bad news for 20 years. He could not find the detachment. The email was not a negotiating position. It was not the opening move in a dispute. It was a door closing, clearly and finally, on a version of his professional life that had taken 2 decades to build. The board had voted unanimously. Jeffrey, who had been his partner for 11 years, had ended the message without a single word of personal support, not because Jeffrey was unkind, but because there was nothing in what Jeffrey knew that made support appropriate. That, Richard thought, sitting in the dark with the Dubai skyline outside the window, was perhaps the most accurate measure of where things actually stood. He sat until the suite went dark around him, and then he sat in the dark for a while longer, and the night continued without him. He thought about the 15 years, not sentimentally. He thought about them the way he thought about a position that had been closed against him. The decision points. The fundamental miscalculation about who the other party was. He had married Catherine Sterling because she was the right kind of person for the life he was building. He had been clear-eyed about that at the time and had not considered it cynical. She was intelligent and composed and came from the right kind of family and managed the social dimension of their shared life with a competence that he had always taken for granted because it was so consistent and so seamless that it had eventually become invisible to him. That was the thing about truly excellent work. It disappeared into the background of ordinary life and left no trace of its own presence. He had stopped seeing the work. He had stopped seeing her. He had been managing a simplified version of her for years without ever updating the file. And somewhere in the unexamined space between the version he managed and the person who actually existed, something had been building. He had made a decision about Catherine in the first 2 years of the marriage and had never once revisited it. He had been managing a simplified version of her that bore enough surface resemblance to the actual person that the difference had never become visible. The actual person had just walked into his suite and in 45 minutes had dismantled 20 years of professional reputation and a 15-year marriage with the precision of someone who had been preparing for a very long time. He looked out the window at Dubai below him. The city did not know or care about the celestial suite or its occupant. Far below, at the level of the street, a man was pushing a cart along the service road that ran beside the hotel, methodical and unhurried, going about the ordinary mechanics of an ordinary morning. Richard watched him for a while. The man with the cart was doing his job with a methodical, unhurried attention that Richard found himself unable to look away from. It was such a specific thing. Someone who knew exactly what the task was doing it, and would finish it. And it would be done. There was no gap between the work and the person doing it. The work was not a means to something else, or a platform for something else, or an expression of something else. It was simply work, done well, at the necessary pace, without performance. Richard had been performing for 20 years. In boardrooms and on trading floors and at dinners and in the management of his private arrangements and in the version of himself he had decided to present to his wife and in the version of himself he had presented to Sienna. He had been constructing and maintaining a version of himself for so long that he was no longer entirely certain what was underneath the construction. There was something in that sight, the complete self-sufficiency of someone simply doing a task, that felt very far away from the gilded room in which he was sitting. He had been building for 20 years to be above all of that, to be someone for whom the ordinary mechanics of life were managed by other people. He was beginning to understand that the distance he had placed between himself and ordinary consequence was not protection, it was blindness. At some point in the early morning he heard Sienna's bedroom door. Then her voice, different in register now, something more earnest and more private, the tone of someone negotiating for their own survival rather than executing a strategy. She was on the phone for a long time. He had a memory, surfacing now with unwelcome clarity, of a late evening at the office months earlier, a deadline run that kept them both in the building past midnight. He had needed a report pulled quickly from his personal drive and had given her his login rather than wait for IT. He had thought nothing of it. He had not thought much about Sienna at all, in the sense of thinking about her as a person with her own agenda and her own risk calculations. He had thought about what she provided to him, which was a specific kind of attention and warmth. He had not thought about what she might need from him in return, or what she might be building toward, or what she might already have. That was the same error he had made with Catherine, scaled down and running in parallel. He had decided what each of these women was for and had stopped paying attention beyond that category. He had treated the people closest to him the way he treated market positions, as things to be managed toward outcomes he had already determined. Neither of them had cooperated with that framing. They had both been doing something else entirely, in the space of his inattention, and he was only now understanding the full scope of what that something else had been. After she had been talking for a long time and then gone quiet, he heard her door open. She came out dressed in what she had arrived in, which told him she had made a decision at some point in the night and was moving through it. Her bag was over her shoulder. She was holding the strap with both hands in the way people held things they were not going to put down. She looked at him, not the bright-focused Sienna of the past 14 months. Something quieter and older and more stripped down. "Javier is taking me to the executive wing," she said. "She agreed to see me." Richard looked at the bag. "What do you have?" he said. She did not answer immediately. He watched her decide. "When you needed files pulled quickly late at night. You used to give me your login for the personal drive," she said. "I kept the login 3 weeks ago. When it became clear that this was not going to be what you had told me it was going to be, I went into the drive. There are 2 sets of accounts, correspondence with contacts at 2 other firms, a trading pattern in the 6 months before certain positions that would be difficult to describe as coincidental." She kept his eyes. "I made copies. And now you are going to trade them," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You told me your marriage was an arrangement in name only," she said. You told me you were building something real with me. You had decided what I was useful for, and you managed me toward it. And you never once thought about whether what I believed about any of it was accurate." She paused. "I am not going to absorb the consequences of your decisions. I have these files, and I am going to manage my situation with what is available to me." He could have said something. He found he had nothing to say that served any purpose that mattered now. "Go," he said. She hesitated for one fraction of a second. Then she went. The suite was empty. The morning came fully through the glass walls and lay across the marble floor in a long, clean line of light. Richard sat in the armchair and did not move for a while. He was not in shock exactly, because shock required encountering something genuinely unexpected, and very little of the past 12 hours had been genuinely unexpected. He had known, from the moment of the credit card freeze, what the shape of things was. He had known from the moment Catherine walked through the door what the outcome was going to be. What he had not been prepared for was the experience of watching it unfold from inside it, of watching a plan that was not his own execute itself with a precision and a comprehensiveness that he would have admired in a different context. He thought about Catherine at her desk somewhere in this building, working through her morning with the same focused attention she had always brought to everything. Currently reviewing the operational report for a hotel portfolio she had apparently been preparing to manage for longer than he had known the portfolio existed. He thought about what it meant that the man he had dismissed in 8 words at a wedding had turned out to be the hinge on which his entire life would turn. He was 52 years old. He had 4 missed calls from Jeffrey and 2 from his personal solicitor, and a preliminary FCA inquiry waiting for him when he landed in London. He had a notepad in his jacket pocket and a boarding pass in economy class and a criminal defense firm's voicemail to return. These were the facts available to him on the far side of a marriage and a career and 15 years of decisions made on the assumption that the people closest to him were not paying attention. They had been paying attention. He had not been. That was the whole of it, stated plainly. Catherine's working office at the Serafina Grand was a spare, functional room on the executive floor. A clear glass desk, 2 chairs, a view of the Gulf from a window that was large but not ostentatious. She had been reviewing the second quarter operational figures when Javier's call came. She set the report down and said she would see Ms. Vance in 5 minutes. Sienna Vance sat down across from her and placed her bag on her lap and held the strap with both hands. She was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had the expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation through the night and arrived at a version she believed she could deliver without losing her composure. "You asked to see me," Catherine said. "Yes, I have something to offer you." She placed a small silver flash drive on the desk between them. On this drive are copies of Richard's private accounts from the personal server in his office, not the Sterling Capital corporate records. A parallel set that his partners do not know exists. He has been using them to cover personal trading losses through the corporate accounts for at least 3 years. There are also emails, correspondence with 2 other women, both junior employees at competing firms, arranged through a pattern of inside information exchanged for professional favors. Everything is documented and current. Catherine looked at the drive without picking it up. "Why?" she said. Sienna took a careful breath. "Because yesterday I thought I was in something that was going to amount to something real. Today I understand what it actually was. He had decided what I was for, and he had managed me toward that purpose. And when this situation became difficult, he was going to minimize his own exposure at the cost of mine." She paused. "I am not going to do that for him." Catherine considered her. She had known when she built the plan that Sienna was a variable she could not fully control. She had expected calculation, maybe fear, perhaps a loyalty born out of self-interest that would complicate things. She had not anticipated this. A young woman arriving before sunrise with evidence that completed the case, delivered not entirely out of pure strategic interest, but out of the specific anger of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of how they were used. She picked up the drive and turned it once. "What are you asking for?" she said. Sienna stated it clearly and without embellishment. A settlement sufficient to relocate and start somewhere new. A personnel file on her desk in London buried rather than pursued. No named role in any proceedings. She would be a confidential source and nothing else. And, if possible, a professional reference through a third party, though she understood if that was outside what Catherine was willing to offer. Catherine set the drive down and folded her hands. She thought, briefly, about the woman she had been before Harold died. Before Singapore, before the reservation flag appeared on her screen. The woman who had organized galas and managed the household calendar and told herself, for 15 years, that the arrangement was worth it. She thought about how different a person you could become when you stopped making that trade. There was something in Sienna Vance's situation that she recognized. Not the specific circumstances, but the underlying dynamic. A woman who had walked into someone else's architecture and had built her own plans within it, and was now discovering the limits of that approach. The motivations were entirely different, and the choices had been entirely different, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But the specific experience of sitting across from the consequences of having decided to operate within a framework controlled by someone who did not actually see you, that she understood more directly than she would have expected. "You understand," she said to Sienna, "what the information on this drive adds to what I already have. It moves this from a civil matter into a criminal jurisdiction. I understand that, and you are providing it anyway." "He was going to let me take the consequences for his decisions," Sienna said. "He had decided I was not a threat, the same way he decided you were not a threat." She met Catherine's eyes. "We both know what those reasons were." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. The gulf outside the window was doing what it always did, moving in its old indifferent way. She thought about the 6 weeks behind her, the transition review by day and the case preparation by night, the division of labor between the professional obligation she had inherited and the personal one she had decided to execute simultaneously. She had told no one outside her legal team what she was building. She had carried the plan alone, quietly and completely, without asking anyone to carry it with her. The difference from everything she had carried before was that this time the carrying was toward something that was entirely her own. "David Chen will draw up an agreement," she said, "the settlement you have described, contingent on verification of the drive's contents. Confidentiality agreement so comprehensive that you will not discuss any element of this matter in any context at any point in the future. Personnel file disappears. Your name appears in no documentation, testimony, or proceedings arising from this matter. As for the reference," she added, "I will provide one through a third party, conditional on the drive being what you say it is. Do we have an agreement?" "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Sienna said. Catherine nodded once. "Then David Chen will see you out. There is a car for the airport. Whatever you do from here, do it on your own terms, not someone else's." Sienna stood. She said nothing further. She went. Catherine sat alone with the drive on the glass desk and the morning outside the window and the operational report open on her laptop. She picked up the drive. She called David Chen. She called the FCA contact she had spoken to 3 times in the past 6 weeks. Then she picked up the quarterly report and continued reading, because the Serafina Grand's operational numbers needed her attention, and she had given herself enough time for everything else. Richard was escorted from the Celestial Suite at 8:45 by 2 members of the hotel's security team who walked at a distance that communicated the arrangement clearly without requiring any physical contact. Harrison was at the private elevator. "Your documents, Mr. Sterling." Inside the envelope, his passport. A boarding pass for the 11 o'clock flight to Heathrow in economy class. And a letter on Ethelred Hospitality Group stationery notifying him of the permanent suspension of his guest privileges across all Ethelred properties globally. Signed by David Chen, acting on behalf of the chairperson. It was precise and legal and said nothing personal about anything, which was somehow worse than anything personal would have been. The elevator descended, and they went not through the lobby, with its chandelier and its marble and its beautiful impersonal grandeur, but through a side corridor that deposited them into a service car park. Not the Rolls-Royce, a standard black sedan. He was about to get in when a black Bentley pulled alongside with the smooth, deliberate precision of something placed there with intent. The rear window came down. Catherine. She had changed from the previous afternoon's suit into linen trousers and a silk blouse. Her hair down, sunglasses on. She looked well-rested. She looked like someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had arrived at the far side of it. She held up the silver flash drive. Miss Vance was thorough, she said. The parallel ledgers, the correspondence, the trading pattern across 3 accounts. David's team spent last night verifying the contents. It is everything the FCA needs for a formal referral. This is what makes the rest of this straightforward. You will not contest the divorce. You will not challenge the asset division. You will not pursue any counter-petition or delay any proceeding. You will sign what David places in front of you, without amendment, and you will do it quickly. In return, I will not initiate the criminal referral personally. The FCA's process will run at its own pace without my active contribution. If you cooperate fully, it is possible, not certain, but possible, that the process concludes without a charge. She waited. He looked at her. He tried to find some version of himself that could occupy the space between them with any authority and could not find it. He had used up the last of whatever that resource was somewhere in the previous 12 hours. Why? He said. Without the usual scaffolding his voice normally carried. Just the word. She removed her sunglasses. Because for 15 years you decided who I was, and then you managed me toward your decision, she said. You never updated your assessment. You looked at me and saw something convenient and familiar, and you stopped looking. You were not cruel about it. It was much more ordinary than cruelty. You just decided I was not worth the full attention, and you never once revisited that decision. She paused. I needed you to know that was wrong, not for your benefit, for mine. I want you to understand what that means precisely. It does not mean I am performing strength. It means that for 15 years there was a woman in your house who graduated top of her year from an institution you know the name of, who managed a portfolio to returns you would have respected if a colleague had produced them, who read every financial situation she encountered with the same quality of attention you apply to acquisition targets. And you chose each year not to look at her. You chose to look at the part that was useful to you and to treat the rest as background. That is the thing I needed you to know. She put her sunglasses back on. Find a criminal solicitor before you land, she said. Someone who specializes in financial conduct cases. The FCA's formal notification will come within 6 weeks, and you will want counsel before it arrives. That is the last professional advice I am going to give you. The window came up. The Bentley pulled out of the service car park with the smooth, unhurried certainty of a vehicle that had somewhere important to be, turned into the main driveway, and was gone. Richard stood in the morning heat of Dubai in a rumpled suit in a service car park with a standard car waiting behind him. The building rose into the clear sky in its pale gold curves. 24 hotels in 14 countries. All of it in the hands of the woman he had spent 15 years not looking at. He got in the car. The drive to the airport took 40 minutes, and he sat in the back and looked out the window at a city conducting its ordinary morning without any interest in him, which was, he understood now, the city's permanent and correct relationship to him. He had come here believing he was the architect of the situation. He had built 15 years on the assumption that the people closest to him were predictable and contained. He had been wrong about that in the most systematic and complete way available to a person. He had built a life on the assumption that resources and position were protection against consequence. Catherine had just demonstrated, over the course of 3 days, that the only protection against consequence was not what you owned, but what you had been willing to see. He had owned a great deal for a very long time. He had not been willing to see very much at all. He thought about the city passing outside the car window, about the man he had watched from the tower window pushing a cart along the service road at 5 in the morning, methodical and unhurried. He had looked at that man from 40 floors above him and had felt the specific distance of someone who had arranged his life to be above ordinary consequence. He was sitting in the back of a standard sedan in a service lane of the same city now. The distance was gone. He was in the ordinary machinery of things like everyone else, subject to the same forces and the same reckonings. And the only question that remained was what he intended to do inside that. He had built a life on the assumption that competence and resources were protection against consequence. Catherine had just demonstrated, over the course of 3 days, that the only protection against consequence was not what you owned, but what you had been willing to see. He had owned a great deal for a very long time. He had not been willing to see very much at all. The city passed by outside the window, going about its business, and the car moved toward the airport. And he sat in the back of it and tried to think about what kind of man he was going to have to become. At the terminal, the air conditioning hit him first. That particular quality of temperature that airports maintained, regardless of what was happening outside. He stood in the arrivals into departures transition zone for a moment, phone reconnecting, and felt the ordinary machinery of the place close around him. Other passengers moved past him in both directions. None of them knew what had happened in the celestial suite of the Serafina Grand in the past 3 days. None of them knew that a man was standing in the terminal at Dubai International with his professional life suspended and his marriage ending and his freedom conditionally preserved, processing the experience of having been completely outplayed by the person he had spent 15 years not looking at. The airport did not know and did not care. The flights were departing on their schedules. The people were going where they were going. He was going to London in economy class with 4 missed calls from Jeffrey and 2 from his personal solicitor and 1 from a criminal defense firm he did not recognize. He sat down in a chair at the economy gate and looked at the flight board and thought about what needed to happen in what order. He found the small notepad he had carried in his jacket pocket for 20 years and wrote at the top of the first page the name from the voicemail. He sat for a moment with the notepad open on his knee, a criminal solicitor specializing in financial conduct cases. 3 weeks ago, he would have considered this a category that applied to other people, the kind of legal problem that happened to men who were careless, who made obvious errors. He had not been careless. He had been systematic and thorough and had applied professional discipline to the management of his private life with the same attention he applied to everything else. What he had not done was apply any of that attention to the people who were closest to him. He had decided a long time ago that the people in his private life did not require the same quality of attention as the people in his boardroom. And this was where that decision had led him. It was possible that this was a correctable error. He was 52 years old, and he had enough professional experience left. The FSCA inquiry resolved favorably to build something different. He did not know yet what different would look like, but he knew, sitting in the economy gate at Dubai International with the departure board above him and the notepad on his knee, that the version of himself that had arrived at this hotel 5 days ago was not a version he could return to. Something had been exposed, and once exposed, it could not be covered over again. He was going to have to build from what was actually there, not the legal strategy, though that needed to begin today. He thought about the longer question, the one that the legal strategy was nested inside. He had been running a version of his life for 15 years that was built on the assumption that the people who served as its foundation were stable, predictable, and beneath the level of threat. He now had complete and inescapable evidence that this assumption was wrong. Building on it again would produce the same result. He was 51 years old, and he had enough time left to do something different, if he decided to. He put the notepad away and looked out at the tarmac and the heat rising off it in waves. And the plane moved to the gate, and he got on board. He sat in the middle seat in row 31, and the man beside the window was already asleep, and the woman on his other side was watching something on her phone with earbuds in. And the plane was an ordinary plane full of ordinary people going about their ordinary business. and Richard Sterling sat in his ordinary seat in economy class, and for the first time in a very long time he was simply one of them, not the architect of the situation, not the person other people were reading and adjusting to, just a man in a seat on a plane, going home to a city that would look exactly the same as it had when he left it, and that would be, in every way that actually mattered, completely different. In the working room on the executive floor of the Serafina Grand, Catherine Sterling opened her laptop and returned to the second quarter figures. The operational report for the property was detailed and required real attention, and she gave it real attention, because she had always worked best when the work was entirely and unmistakably hers. David Chen called at 10 to confirm that the drive's contents had been fully verified and the FCA package was ready to file on her instruction. She told him to hold it for 30 days and resubmit only if Richard failed to execute the initial filings on schedule. David said that was a generous arrangement. She said it was a practical one. Then she said the staff review needed to be completed by Friday and the Q3 projections on her desk by Tuesday, and they ended the call. She held her teacup and looked out the window at the Gulf. The water was moving in its old, different way, the same water that had been there before any of this and would be there long after. She thought about Harold, who had built this company quietly for 50 years and kept its ownership private until the right moment, who had seen something in her that she had not yet fully seen in herself, and who had passed it on with the simple, clean conviction that she would know what to do with it. She had visited him in his last year, in the quiet house in Wiltshire, where he had lived for 30 years. He had been very old and very clear, the way very old people sometimes were, unclouded by the concerns that occupied the middle of a life. He had said to her, sitting in his garden in the late afternoon, that the most important thing he had learned from 50 years of building something was that power without preparation was just noise. She had thought she understood what he meant at the time. She understood it better now. She had visited him in his last year, in the quiet house in Wiltshire where he had lived for 30 years. He had been very old and very clear, the way very old people sometimes were, unclouded by the concerns that occupied the middle of a life. He had said to her at the end of one of those visits, sitting in his garden in the late afternoon, that the most important thing he had learned from 50 years of building something was that power without preparation was just noise. She had thought she understood what he meant at the time. She understood it better now. She thought about the kitchen in Chelsea on a Tuesday morning, the coffee, the words "have a safe flight," said to a man who was lying to her, delivered in exactly the right tone, carrying the full weight of what she already knew and had chosen to carry quietly until the moment was right. The moment had come. She had been ready for it. She set down the teacup, opened the quarterly report, and went back to work. She had 24 properties and a full leadership transition and a staff review due Friday and Q3 projections due Tuesday and a board communication to prepare, and 2 pending property development assessments that needed her sign-off before the end of the week. This was, she thought, exactly the right amount of work. Not the right amount in the sense of being manageable or comfortable. The right amount in the sense of being proportionate to the size of the thing she had taken on, and to the person she was when she was allowed to be fully herself. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had always been exactly where she was supposed to be. It had just taken the right stage for anyone to see it. The quarterly report required her full attention, and she gave it her full attention, and the afternoon moved through the office in its long, clear light, and the Gulf outside the window did what it always did, and Catherine Sterling worked at the desk that was hers and felt, underneath the ordinary progress of the day, something she did not have a simple word for. It was not triumph. Triumph implied an opponent, and she had not been fighting Richard so much as she had been fighting the version of herself she had been allowing to exist for 15 years. It was not relief exactly, though there was relief in it. It was something closer to the sensation of putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long you had forgotten it was not part of your body. She had put it down. The work was still there. The work had always been there. She had just, finally and completely, made it her own. She finished the section of the report she was working on and moved to the next one and worked with the absorbed, self-directed attention that she had spent 15 years applying to other people's priorities and was now applying to her own. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the office. Outside the window, the gulf continued. Somewhere in London, Richard Sterling was on a plane that had not yet landed, or was in an airport, or was in a car, moving through the city toward whatever came next for him. She did not spend time thinking about what that was. She had given enough of her time to what was next for Richard Sterling. The quarterly report needed attention. She gave it attention. That was, in the end, a complete answer to everything. If you stayed with this story to the end, thank you. Stories like this one are why this channel exists. If it moved you or surprised you or made you feel something worth your time, please hit the like button and share it with someone who would appreciate it. Subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you will not miss what comes next. More stories are on the way.